So just stand by, it's initializing. And we're live.
Good afternoon and welcome to Ask Me Anything. I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast and my guest is Josh.
With Tilson.
Josh Broder of Tilson, CEO of Tilson. I am so excited to be here to spend this hour with Josh and with all of you in this community. Tilson has just kind of, I don't know whether we say grown like a weed or like a rocket. I mean, it's just like going crazy. 1,400 employees, and this is up from like 12 several years back. So Josh, just give us the quick story of Tilson and its growth and what you're doing in the broadband space right now.
Sure. So I'll take like a rocket ship, not like a weed. It's not trimmed later. But we started Tilson with the idea that people needed good advice about building their infrastructure, and we did that as consultants. So we were being analytical and providing good advice and coaching and some outsourced management, and we got frustrated that we couldn't really give good advice unless we had good designs and cost estimates, and you can't really do good cost estimates unless you're doing some engineering. So we went from consultants to engineers, and ultimately we got a little frustrated that a lot of our projects get put on the shelf and didn't get built, or wanted to get built but couldn't find the right resources. So we then became constructors. And then our customers said, okay, so you built it, what do we do when we fix it? Be like, guys over here. And they'd call those guys and then call us back and say, like, they didn't do a great job. Could you come fix this for us? And we said, yeah, sure. Okay, we'll fix it. And then customers started saying, okay, so I want you to fix it, but how do I know when it's broken? And so we started providing some operational support services through an outsourced cloud knock. And so all those things are what our services company does. We consult, we design, we build, we provide maintenance services, and we'll provide remote monitoring of networks. And we do that nationally through the US. And somewhere along the way, I think it might have been 2014-ish, some customers told us, that's great that you can design, build our stuff, but there are situations where we might want you to finance and own some of that infrastructure.
Right.
And we said, okay, we can do that. So we started Tilson Infrastructure in 2014. We spun it out as its own company in 2019. It's actually a different company than the Tilson Services company that most people know. And so now we also finance and operate some infrastructure, which for us are generally poles, towers, and some long-haul fiber routes.
Well, you have of course given us a great summary of so much of what we want to talk about here. Let's go back to the beginning a little bit more. And before you became CEO of Tilson, and as was noted in the article posted in the broadband community, you didn't found it, but you practically did, like you were employee number 3 or so, and you've grown it since then, since I guess 2000. So tell me a little bit about what you did in the military that got you interested in telecom, because it's a very interesting story, and I think you'd obviously be better to capture it. So tell us a little bit about that, Josh.
Sure. So anybody who's in telecom kind of arrived there accidentally. There's not a lot of people who, when they were 6 and people were dressing up as firemen and stuff, like, I want to be a telecom engineer when I grow up. So you sort of wind up in it accidentally, and that's what happened to me. I had gone to college on a Army ROTC scholarship, and sort of the deal was, if you put your nose to the grindstone and you made your grades and you did well in the ROTC stuff, then you could choose your assignment. You get to choose what part of the Army you wanted to be in. Think like infantry, aviation, armor, and you got to choose your first assignment. And assuming they had a seat and a location that worked, if you made the grades, you could go do that. And so I had wanted to be a Army military intelligence officer leading a group in Japan. And it looked like I was going to be able to go do that. And when September 11th happened, it also impacted the Pentagon, not just the Trade Center. And when the plane hit the Pentagon actually killed the group of people that were meeting to determine where my year cohort was going to be, going and doing. And I wound up in the Signal Corps. Bunch of this, like a little bit of a longer story there, but after not getting an assignment for a while because of the chaos, I wound up in the Signal Corps. So it was a part of the Army that provided communications. Signal Corps goes all the way back to the time with the guys with the flags, kind of communicating that way. And through that experience, I wound up leading a unit that was based in Europe and deployed all over the world, designing and building and operating networks. And sort of my last assignment in the Army was building a big IP network in Afghanistan. It was sort of moving from sort of analog to digital, and having a packet network, and Predator drone feeds were all the hotness, and telephone networks couldn't support drone feeds. So built a big IP network there with a big unit, and got out of the Army and went looking for something to do. So I moved back to Maine and got involved with Tilson.
So is there a difference? It's just sticking on the military signal core for a moment. Is there a difference between the technology, the IP technology that is used to kind of facilitate the kind of capacity to do things like drones versus sort of out in the fields signals and what we kind of think of, or is this just kind of all one big seamless, broadband connection that maybe has a couple different security elements?
Yeah, so there's some slide somewhere in some sales presentation for companies like Lockheed and General Dynamics where probably it looks pretty seamless, but it's not. And at the time I was doing that, we were transitioning from like stuff that was in a green box that was sold by an aerospace company that focused on defense, to kind of the stuff that we all know and love as telecom people off the shelf, Cisco routers and Dell servers, and all of the equipment that has come out of civil telecommunications. And so sort of my projects were often to go into a place and establish telecom for the first time, or if it had been previously established, like on that Afghanistan rotation, someone had previously come in and put in 16 kilobit scritchy scratchy, field phones. I say scritchy scratchy, like it wasn't 64 kilobit Sprint pin drop phones. They were field phones. You could hammer a tent peg in with them. And to go from that to drone feeds on everybody's laptop or mobile device, whether they were in a foxhole or at a command post, meant that we had to move to an IP network, and all that stuff was commercial off-the-shelf technology. So that was an opportunity to kind of learn how telecom companies build their networks. And, you could think of us like a telecom company in those places, providing what then was kind of really modern IP networks kind of for the first time.
Right. Well, and kind of you think more recently about the recent military conflicts. The one in Israel is so recent that I don't know if the stories have come out, but the Russia's invasion of Ukraine has brought a lot of attention on the incredible role of telecom networks, the incredible role of instantaneous communications, of even crowdsourcing positions of different units. Do you keep up with military telecommunications, Josh?
Not really. I mean, I've been out of it for 20 years, so I don't have a lot of insight on that except what I read in the news. But I think it's true that like virtually every application of human life, industry, and I assume defense now, benefits from connectivity, and there's a lot more technology in the toolbox than when I was doing that. We would mostly come to a remote place via satellite and then spread that signal out via microwave or fiber. And, Starlink wasn't a thing yet. And, LEO technology has brought down the cost and increased the speeds and lowered the latencies of broadband connection. So I'm assuming defense industry is enjoying the fruits of all of that. But I think increasingly civil telecom is driving the train here, whatever the state of the art that we're enjoying in the technologies that we use every day, or what the defense guys are going to put into place. There was a time, and that time's decades ago, where defense was driving the train on that, and those applications were first. But I think at this point, the most modern stuff is supported by private investors and is out in the market. And then they're trying to figure out how to adapt that to the defense context.
To the defense. Well, okay, so that's 20 years ago. Now let's go back just 10 years ago, okay? And I think we might have first interacted around the BTOP, the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program. I, of course, was in the state broadband office at the time, and I know this is kind of where Tilson really took off. So let's talk a little bit about that first round of infrastructure investments, and not only how it affected Tilson and your founding, so to speak, but what's your thoughts on how that round of investment paves the way for what we're in the middle of right now, Josh?
Yeah, so I'll go back to 2007. I joined Tilson right out of the Army, and I got hired by the original founder of Tilson, a guy by the name of Mike Dow, and he had been a construction company CIO and had deployed big IT and systems for big field construction companies. And he hired me to sort of join him on the mission to go consult. And so we did that together and hired a bunch of other people. And right about 2008, October 2008, we got a call from our 5 biggest clients who all said stop work. For folks who were, old enough to be in, commercial context in 2008, it was about October when the wheels kind of seized up and the economy just stopped working, and the bottom dropped out. And so we sat around a little plastic table in our tiny little one-room artist studio office and said, what are we going to do? And, we decided to, go to half rations on salary and figure out what was going to come next. And we thought the thing that was going to come next was going to be federal stimulus, and broadband was becoming a hot topic at the time. And they did. So by 2009, federal government had announced a bunch of programs, one of which was BTOP, the Broadband Technologies Opportunity Program, coming out of the NTIA, a sub of Commerce. And we lined up with a few companies and won a bunch of grants, mostly as vendors to those companies and private investors and public agencies who won those grants. And one award led to another award, which led to another award, and before you knew it, we had a bunch of BTOP grant contracts working as a contractor to BTOP grant winners, and we had also won some Department of Energy projects with power companies that were implementing smart grid technology, which the difference between a smart grid and a dumb grid is a telecom network. So we were putting networks on grids. And that was really meaningful for us. We went from on the ropes and maybe not going to make it as a company to, becoming good size. And we earned our stripes as a big project company doing some of those projects in the early days. When we did our first BTOP project, the biggest fiber network we'd ever built was about 10 route miles. And the second fiber project we ever did was 1,100 route miles. Just to give you a context of what that explosion meant. And so by the time we had finished those things, we had credibly deployed some of the biggest networks that had ever been deployed all at once, right? Lots of telecom companies had bigger networks, but they hadn't been deployed in a year and a half. They'd have been deployed over 2 decades. And so these were some really big projects. And I would say, for us, that was that transformation I was talking about, where we went from consulting on it to engineering it to building it. We were sort of working our way through those gates in that time. And it was probably 2012 timeframe when I wound up buying the company. We were still pretty small in 2012. I don't know, maybe 15 employees. And at that time, the original founder guy, Mike Dow, had the opportunity to go to work for some of my Army buddies back overseas. And so that was the occasion of me buying the company. And I had decided, look, I was happy to be home. I had spent a bunch of time abroad, almost 5 years, and I was really happy to be in Maine. And so, accidentally winding up in telecom, I kind of accidentally wound up owning the company. At the time, I was looking for a loan from a bank to sort of finance the growth, and sort of the fact that loan needed to be personally guaranteed was a conversation starter on the sale of the company. And I wound up going back to that same bank and saying, look, I'll guarantee it, but I need a loan to buy the company too. And luckily, it was small enough that it wasn't that big a loan at the time, but it still took me a bunch of years to pay it off.
Mm-hmm. Well, So as an accidental CEO, what have you learned, right? I mean, what's it been like? I mean, we hear this, CEOs, the culture of startups is strong right now. Lots of people kind of have that aspiration. How are you looking back on it from the view of 10 plus years? What do you think about the things that people who are interested in that path should be aware of and learning?
Yeah,
Josh?
well, it's gosh, that's a great question. I I was a I was a accidental CEO in that moment, but I was an intentional leader. I had sought out originally that Army ROTC scholarship to go to college because I was interested in leading people. And so sort of the first job as a CEO was leading a team. Um, then they also have to have a business strategy and know how to manage, and all those things are important. But fundamentally, a CEO is a leader of a group of people who are trying to get a thing done. And so I found the leadership part of it pretty easy. But I would say the business part of it I had to learn. And you said your question was, what did I learn through all that? And the first thing is always have more cash than you think you need. um, because when you're around big capital projects, you can tie up a lot of cash for a long time, and particularly in services. I would say, like, if you look at the anatomy of companies that didn't make it along the way, and we've all heard examples of companies that fell out along the wayside over the years. Probably not having sufficient cash was one of those problems. I think the other part is governance. So the anatomy of most, small, closely held private companies are that you have like a dictator CEO person who's a majority shareholder, and they kind of make all the decisions. And so the other thing we see in the anatomy of companies who fall out is crummy governance, where, a CEO was kind of winging it and there was nobody to ask him a tough question or push on that person's point of view. And so one of the things we've gotten right over the years is we brought in the right investors to have the liquidity we need to do our projects, and also to have like serious governance, so that the CEO is not drinking their own Kool-Aid.
Who does that for you, Josh? Who's the person who says, Josh, you're on the wrong path here, you need to course correct? How do you get that advice from people that work for you?
I've got a pretty sophisticated board today. It's a 9-member board, of which I am one member. But the people on the board are serious people who mostly have more experience than I do. One of them is Paul Anderson, who, before he retired to the coast of Maine and made an investment in a little company called Tilson, was the CEO of Duke Energy. And before that, he was the CEO of the biggest mining company in the world, BHP Billiton. He's got a serious leader guy. I've got a couple of great investors on the board, who ask me tough questions and have more financial experience than I do, and also have operating experience. There's a woman on the board who is a former executive at AIG. There's a woman on the board who's the chief administrative officer of Brookfield's data center platform, and she's also an attorney. So these are serious people who ask serious questions, and oftentimes they ask me a question I didn't anticipate. And a lot of times, if they call me out on something, I agree with them. And I'm like, oh gosh, I'm glad you pointed that out, because that would have been a mistake. So, I think that governance piece is often overlooked. And, people assume that CEOs and entrepreneurs have all the answers, and you better have a lot of answers. But if you think you have all the answers, you probably get yourself into trouble.
If we were to put on a graph the kind of the growth curve of Tilson, so you talked about it being a 12-person operation, maybe you said 6, back in 2012. Where did it go, year by year? And when did you kind of hit that spike that you're at now? And is the spike going to keep growing? Give us a taste for that employee headcount that you've got there.
So, our growth has been fast, but it's been consistent. We haven't had the same amount of growth every year, but our average compounding annual growth rate, CAGR, is about 30%, going back to 2012. And if you come into the in years, if you shorten that time frame, it gets a little higher. It's more like 40%. So probably our growth has been accelerating over time is another way to think about that. But it's been consistently big year over year. And so the Inc. 5000 publishes a list of the 5,000 fastest growing companies in America. And it's pretty easy to get on the list. If you're in a small business, you're a $5 million business, and you have a $10 million year, you're making the list. What you often see, though, is companies come on and off the list. And we've been on the list for 13 consecutive years. And only 0.5% of the listed companies, not even 0.5%, I think it's like 0.05%, 0.005%, have been listed for 13 consecutive years. And so I think what's remarkable about Tilson is the sustainability of the growth. We're not just having good years and bad years, but we are wired for growth. And so that means you got to build a company a little bit differently to sustain that. And so we're adding about 100 plus people a month. The most current number I have is October. We hired 136 or 137 employees, right? We don't have perfect retention. So, we'd be net something a little lower than that up for the month, but you start to play out those numbers month over month. And, I think the growth will continue at this rate.
So right now we're kind of in a moment where everyone's planning for preparing for the BEAD investment, plus the others, the middle mile investments and so forth. And so, $65 billion of IIJA, which of course is amplified by the match funds and the state pools and so forth. So it's kind of clear we're in a moment of investment, so to speak. But what about during those lean years, like from 15 to 2020, before the pandemic, and everyone realized, oh my gosh, we need to have fiber symmetrical networks? What is the state of growth, or how did you manage that, or how are you, really maybe more to the point, how are you preparing for those lean years in the future right now as you're building this company, Josh?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Drew, because the one thing that would be obvious to anybody that works in technology is that the technology changes pretty frequently. And the thing you're doing today is probably not the thing you're doing tomorrow. And so if you look back on the history of the company, it's a history of pivots. And as each technology change happened, we pivoted again. So I told you a little bit about what we were doing during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act period. That was that like 2010 through 13 kind of time frame. And if you were doing those projects, you had to pivot because eventually the money ran out. It was like kind of the question you're asking about today's ramp. Like I can kind of look back to the last one and say, well, what happened between then and now? What did I do between the stimulus surges? And so in 2012, we had a meeting of the managers in the company, and we said, well, this federal stimulus story is going to end. We better go find somebody to pay us to keep doing work. And the thing that was hot then was LTE deployment, right? So that was 4G on the cellular side. And so we said, hey, let's go build a site acquisition group and a civil engineering group that does the kind of tower structural drawings and construction drawings. And let's go build a tower climbing group. We built all those groups in that 2012-13 timeframe. And we went from doing mostly public money work to mostly private money work, kind of in the 2013 timeframe. I think I remember we won a contract with General Dynamics as a sub on a AT&T turf project in upstate New York. And we hired all the Maine National Guardsmen and drove them out to a Staybridge Suites in upstate New York and took that over and made that our New York headquarters. And we built like 700 or 800 AT&T sites over the next year. And, by the time the next year came, AT&T had bought DirecTV, and 4G was pretty far along, and they were in a little bit of a CapEx holiday, and we said, gosh, we got to do something else. So we found Sprint Vision's project in the Southeast. We want to contract changing light bulbs for Crown Castle in the Northeast on their towers. You have to do that a lot less now that there's LEDs, but back then those lights burned out a lot. And we started building fiber to the cell site, which was becoming a new thing. And I was a fiber to the data center. And so for us, it was not only where like, where's the CapEx? But it was like, what is the technology that's going to drive growth here? And so, we knew that the cellular stuff was going to end. Like all the 4G was eventually going to be up on towers. So what was next? And as we went looking around for that work, we saw that Verizon had an initiative to build small cells, and they had been renting them from folks like Exonet and Crown for a while, but they wanted to self-perform and own their own facilities. They were calling it owner's economics. And as we were looking at that, we thought, gosh, it's pretty hard to put stuff on utility poles, and I bet the cellular guys are going to struggle with it. So we called on Verizon in New England. We went to their office, and I put together a slide deck of all of the wireless devices we had put on utility poles for the electric companies. Turns out that when Verizon built in those days a small cell, it looked like a white can on an antenna, a white can antenna on a pole. And when the power company did a meter reading kind of system that was wireless, they put a white can on a pole. It's like the same thing. And so I went in there with a slide deck and said, hey, we put wireless on poles. And they're like, great, we're looking for guys who put wireless on poles. So this is kind of a funny true story about how this stuff goes.
And it was a white can. And it was a white can, right?
Yeah, it was a white can. It was like the same thing. And to someone who doesn't own a pole, the pole owner is kind of like a hostile counterparty. But we knew what the pole owner wanted. Like, things had to be far enough apart so nobody got electrocuted. Like, there are standards around that stuff. It's an engineering discipline, and like, we knew about it. And so I said to that local Verizon office, I said, okay, let's go. Like, how many of these things do you want to build? And they're like, oh, we're going to build thousands. I said, like, great. When can we start? They said, oh, we just looked in our contract and in our system, and you don't have a contract. And I said, okay, well, give me a contract. And they said, no, it's like too hard to do. I said, what do you mean it's too hard to do? And they said, no, we can't give you a contract because nobody here, we haven't hired a new vendor in 10 years. And it's just too hard to do. And so I said, good grief. So like, I have the thing you want, but you can't use me because I don't have a contract and you don't know how to give me a new contract. They're like, yes, that. So I said, oh, shucks. Okay, well, call me if you change your mind. I'm like, gosh, this was kind of like my Hail Mary to find something for the company to do now that we're done working on towers for a little while. And so I went home, and, I was like young, single. I'm a low sleep guy. So like, I tend to work at night most nights. And I was like up online looking at stuff, and I somehow found my way onto the Verizon supplier diversity website. And they had a web form that said, like, if you're a diverse supplier, and they listed a bunch of like socioeconomic categories. And one of them was a veteran-owned business. And I'm like, I'm a veteran-owned business. I filled out the form. And I don't know, that was like 2 a.m. I went to bed. 2:30, my phone rings. I got a flip phone at this point. Nice 4G flip phone. And it was a guy in India, like Verizon Data Services, like their India business process outsourcing affiliate or something. He called me. He's like, hey, I got your web form here. It says you're a veteran-owned business. Can I ask you a few questions so we can complete the process? He's like, I didn't expect you to answer. It's like 2:30 your time, right? I said, oh yeah, it's fine. I mean, like, you didn't get spam calls back then, right? Like,
right. We didn't get him many.
Yeah. Indian number. I was like, kind of wondering who's calling me. So I stayed on the phone with this guy for 2 hours. We finished the process, and I had a vendor number by morning.
Wow.
And so next day I call a guy back in New England. I'm like, hey, I got a vendor number. He's like, you do not. I said, I got a vendor number. This guy in India called and got me a vendor number. And anyway, so from there, we wound up building a bunch of Verizon small cells all over the country. And that led to the next thing. So if you look back at our history, like, well, what technology made the company? Well, it was middle mile fiber, and then it was smart grid technology, and then it was 4G on towers, and then it was 4G on poles, and then it was 5G on poles, and then it was fiber to the home. Like, pick a trend. Our value proposition as a company is not grinding out the same thing we did 10 years ago for 2 cents cheaper. We're at the front of the change cycle, trying to help our customers understand how to do something new and difficult, and then how to scale that activity.
Wow. No, this is fascinating. Well, let's get some questions from some of the many people who have chimed in here. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit. We've got a question from Nida Shalavi about AI, about incoming telecom and AI progress. What do you see? I mean, like, obviously we're not a year, and we're 10 years into the exiting of the AI winter, and obviously large language models. This is not my area I don't think it's your area, but it's affecting every area. And so how are you thinking right now at Tilson about AI and the role that it's going to play in telecom networks right now?
So let me start with what I think is happening with AI writ large, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we might use AI. But big picture, this is like the first minute of AI. We are so early, and the hyperscalers, the folks that are providing the core infrastructure that power AI, Google, Meta, Amazon, these folks who build really big technology infrastructure facilities to do this processing already know that it's going to be really demanding and they're going to need a lot more infrastructure. And so, I'm not an AI expert, but my insights on how it relates to telecom is that it's driving a huge amount of data center development. And that data center development also needs connectivity. And I think if you asked somebody 5 years ago, 6 years ago, where are we in long haul connectivity? They would have said, it's kind of mostly done. All the cities have been connected, there's rings and it kind of works okay. But, you look at it today and some of that fiber is more than 20 years old. Some of it's 30 years old. And old fiber is kind of a problem. It doesn't work as well. And there's new kinds of fiber that work better. We're starting to see actual installations of hollow core fiber for lower latency applications. A totally different kind of fiber. So all of a sudden we have more data centers because of AI. And those new data centers need connectivity. And the old data centers have kind of crappy fiber to them, not to be too crude, but it was great when it was put in, but today it's kind of dated. And there's some new technologies coming out that may be a little bit disruptive. And so my view from a telecom perspective is that AI is going to drive for data center deployment. It's going to drive the recapitalization of existing fiber routes, and it's driving new fiber routes for better interconnectivity between data centers, and then also the deployment of new technology. So I'm actually quite bullish that AI is going to drive a huge amount of development in telecom. Tactically, as a guy who's running a couple of companies, like every company in the world, we're like, what can we do with AI?
Right.
Could we run a better company? Could we automate some of the things we can do? And at Tilson, we're in the early innings of some of that, but we've successfully deployed AI into a few of our applications, and it's helping humans in the company do work more efficiently.
Now, you discussed how you're a couple of companies, right? And I think you said that Tilson, the vast bulk of these 1,400 people are on your consulting side, your consulting and engineering side. You have a very small number of people on the infrastructure side. And that is to say, you're an asset owner. Could you just speak a little bit about that distinction, why you separated the ventures? Is it because there's a potential conflict? Is there a potential conflict? Just talk a little bit about how the consulting arm of Tilson kind of works with the infrastructure arm of Tilson.
Yeah, great question. So in 2014, when we started the infrastructure company, it was just one company. It was a wholly owned affiliate. And we did it to help a customer out of a bind, out of a jam. They were deploying small cells. I'll tell you another funny story if I could just take like 2 minutes on this.
Go for it. The best.
I was in a Verizon office in New Jersey, and they were deploying small cells, and we had a big assignment out on the Jersey Shore, like Jersey City, Hoboken, Weehawken, those kind of places. And there was a problem because the poles that were on the Riverwalk, like out over the Hudson, imagine like a cantilevered walkway out over the river, were like kind of flossy and small. And so we needed like structurally heavier poles there. And the city was like, we don't want to touch them. And the carrier was like, we don't want to touch them. And the power company was like, we don't want to touch them. And so we thought we might lose the project. Like the whole thing might be canned if we couldn't figure out who was going to own these poles. So we wound up owning the poles to keep the project on the rails. So today, that was like, 10 poles or something. Today, that sort of pole portfolio is 2,500 poles around the country, some big densities in some big cities. And what we thought was, look, this is really its own business. It needs to be capitalized differently. It needs to be managed differently. So we spun it out into its own thing. It has its own leadership. It has its own capitalization and investors. It has different ownership. Like if you were to go look at the investors behind the two companies, there's some different ownership in that. But we took on a private equity partner in that company pretty early, SDC Capital Partners, who's been a great partner. And we think that the companies need to be managed fundamentally differently. And so to your point earlier about employees, I got 15 employees in the infrastructure company and 1,400 employees in the services company. They clearly do really different things. But we own a lot of assets in the infrastructure company, and the people that manage that are focused on that, and the people that manage our services company are focused on services. And we also didn't want to create a competitive dynamic where we help a lot of asset owners build and maintain their facilities, and we didn't want the same people touching both things. And so really they operate pretty independently today. In the early days, there was like a bunch of co-sell, like, hey, we'll build you a thing and we can own this piece for you, and we could still do that. But mostly they're off doing their own thing. And I would say, infrastructure ownership is a really different game than, service company. One's about leading people and the other's about squaring an equation.
And are you the only touch point between the two? You're CEO of both companies, and you've got, as you've said, strong COOs who are really running the respective companies. Are you the only link between the two?
Yeah, so I'm the common bond there as the CEO of both companies. But to your point, Daryl Ingram, who's the COO of the services company, really runs all the day-to-day operations in the services company, and all the leases, who's the COO of the infrastructure company, really runs all the day-to-day operations there. So it gets confusing, like out in the marketplace. People know us as Tilson, but there's actually like really two companies there that are quite different.
Yeah. We got a great question here from Janet Fitzgerald. She asks, are you participating in laying the groundwork for Massachusetts to have 5G? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about 5G and the kind of the marketing story that was 5G and kind of where that stands now. And Janet also asks about the whole issue of electromagnetic frequency. You hear about this issue, and there is a lot of people out there that talk about it in the industry. We tend to kind of dismiss a lot of those, but I do want to just ask it. We do have this question, and I wonder if you could speak to the concern that people have raised about this topic.
Yeah, so let me address that question in its different parts. On are we involved in 5G in Massachusetts? The answer is yes. One of the things about 5G is that it's a wireless technology that's relatively short range. And so the backbone of 5G is actually fiber. And so we've deployed quite a lot of fiber in Massachusetts, as we have in most states in the country, in support of a number of moving data around kind of applications, data centers, cell sites, homes. We have also deployed a lot of fiber to the home in Massachusetts. And so what I would say, kind of getting to that question about like, should it be 5G or should it be fiber to the home? I think both tools have a role in the broadband economy. And I think there should be awesome connectivity everywhere. Everybody should have access to fiber speeds in their house. And I also think everybody should have great mobility, so when they leave their house, it's fast. On the health topic, I am not a expert in medical sciences, and I'm not an RF engineer, but my understanding is that the issue of sort of RF safety is largely a settled matter. RF's been around for a really long time. I mean, it's like intrinsically a part of our literal universe, and humans have been harnessing it for more than 100 years, and it just is it. I haven't seen, because we look at this issue because a lot of people ask us,
everyone.
I just haven't seen compelling data that makes me believe that it's a human health risk at the kind of powers involved in cell phones. And also, I think that the 5G being sort of intrinsically more dangerous than other kinds of RF, I think is a bit of a red herring. I think there's been some evidence that maybe some of that's been, amplified on social media by Russian troll farms. But 5G operates on all kinds of frequencies, as do other Gs. And so 5G is just a protocol used between the radios. And I don't really view 5G as more or less threatening than, any other wireless technology. So if you can live with Wi-Fi, you can live with 5G.
Well, putting that health question aside, I mean, from a business perspective, there certainly was a big push marketing wise around 5G, and it hasn't really been kind of, instantiated just yet. Keith Miller asked the question, what's the expected timeline for carrier wireless projects to pick back up? Do you want to kind of speak? Are we kind of on a holiday from wireless and we're back on wireline, and maybe in the future we flip back? I mean, what's your perspective on that?
So, 5G is a as you mentioned earlier, is kind of a layperson's description of a basket of technologies. And then, you know, it's used in various contexts in marketing, you know, by different companies at different times. Mostly in most parts of the country, 5G is available today. But 5G is not the same everywhere in the country for every carrier in every place. And so what I would say is that there is 5G generally that is deployed on mid-band spectrum. And mid-band spectrum is, as it sounds, not too high, not too low. And it provides a nice mix of propagation and the amount of data it can encode. And 5G mid-band spectrum is like demonstrably faster as deployed in the field than 4G. And like the speed tests bear that out. So our phones are getting faster. We're also consuming more data. So it might not feel a lot better. But what I would say is that had 5G not been deployed, it would be a lot worse. There are places where 5G works exceptionally better than 4G. And these are at places with high band spectrum deployed, millimeter wave spectrum. And the speeds that you can achieve with that very high band spectrum approximate that as fiber. I've seen, like in our own tests on sites we deploy, you know, a gig down and 200 or 300 up is not crazy on millimeter wave. Now I live in Portland, Maine, and across the street from my house is a 5G cellular node that cellular carrier sells a home broadband service on it. And when I take my phone out and stand in my driveway across the street from this 5G node that is fed by fiber, so it's only 200 feet from me, right? It's mostly a fiber network and a little bit of wireless. I get over a gig on my phone, standing right there. When I walk a block away, I pick up another one, and then there's like one block where they don't have one, and I don't get that speed. Wow. And so the 5G that people are experiencing is really different depending on what the carrier has installed near them. And what I would say is generally in rural areas, they've gotten more of this mid-band spectrum that's like pretty good propagation, pretty good speed. And in the urban and suburban areas, they often get this millimeter wave technology, which is way fast. It's not like a little bit faster, it's way faster.
Yeah.
And so I think we're kind of early in 5G.
Interesting. Great perspective.
Yeah, I also think we're going to see some like densification of these networks, meaning there'll be more nodes. And as there's more nodes, the networks will get much faster and have higher capacity.
Let's drill into one of the controversies around BEAD, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, just to kind of define our terms. And obviously, you're doing a lot of work in this space, I presume. Just speak a little bit about that. Tom Ranstrom asked the question, how do you see the requirements for a letter of credit to accept the BEAD grant impeding Tilson or other companies from utilizing the grant? And I should point out for Tom and all of our viewers in the broadband community, we're going to have a special event. I don't know if it's an Ask Me Anything or a special event next Thursday at 12 noon Eastern time to talk about the changes that were announced just 2 days ago to the letter of credit requirement from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And we're going to have 7 different advocates who were pushing for changes on our special program, again, next Thursday, the 9th, on these letter of credit changes. So I didn't mean to undercut completely your answer, Josh, but do tell us what you say to Tom about the letter of credit rules and how they impact not just Tilson, but the ecosystem.
Sure. So, you know, by way of explanation for folks who may not be as familiar with Tom, as Tom is with the issue here that he's referring to is that the federal government's last mile broadband subsidy program called BEAD, the NTIA, has a requirement that grantees, the people who eventually get the money from their state broadband offices, post a letter of credit. And that letter of credit is a form of surety that they're going to do the thing that the grant said they had to do. And without getting into the financial engineering, that letter of credit functionally is a bit like debt. It takes away from the company's financial capacity. As Drew mentioned, the NTIA's received a lot of feedback on this topic, critical feedback around, you know, look, there are lots of entities that want to go build broadband. They're going to struggle financially to meet the bar. Now, that's kind of the point of the rule, which is to say, like, look, you need some financial capacity to be able to do this. So that's true. But it is also true that the higher that bar is, the less kinds of entities and the less individuals who can participate. So The NTIA just released new guidance that softened that letter of credit requirement. And, people are still analyzing their feedback. I think it's less than a day old, this news. My read of it is it really doesn't remove the requirement, but it makes the requirement more flexible, which allows someone who's trying to find a way to be compliant more tools to find more like products and mechanics to get to yes on that, and also allows people to ratchet back the requirement over time as they complete the project a little more quickly. So I think the NTI was quite responsive to all of the public comments they got from broadband offices, from carriers, from individuals, and really tried to stretch to make the program more flexible while also still safeguarding the program from, a company that didn't have the financial capacity or an organization that didn't have the financial capacity, making, sort of getting out over their skis and losing, losing the money.
Well, speaking of state broadband offices, talk a little bit about the work that Tilson is doing with state broadband offices. We've had many, more than a dozen state broadband officers in Ask Me Anything sessions here in the broadband community. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to, again, how Tilson is interacting with them and your view on their role in this process.
Yeah, so one of Tilson's core services has been helping public instrumentalities, particularly state governments and tribal governments and territorial governments, run their broadband programs. And so we provide policy advice and program management support on these programs. And we're currently assisting something like 15 state, tribal, and territorial governments on these projects. And so we're lots of places in the country embedded in those offices, helping to craft their plans, supporting them programmatically. And, we got into that early in our history. I mentioned before we were a consulting company before we were anything else. This is a moment where state broadband offices were, sort of the range of state broadband offices when these big federal subsidies came down were like 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people. That was like pretty well staffed in the spectrum of offices to no state broadband office at all when this money came down. And so those offices are in the process of building their staff capacity, their consulting capacity, and we've been sort of part of the solution around being able to sort of bring the resources and the expertise to bear in those offices as they've moved to ramp up in these programs. So we're really excited because people say, like, how is BEAD affecting you? You build a lot of fiber, right? We say, well, we're actually helping states sort of craft the programs, and those states where we're crafting the programs, you're not going to see us building fiber in those programs. You're going to see us as consultants helping those state offices. And that brought us in, more than a year earlier than sort of deployment activities, would have. And like, just from an impact standpoint, I feel like we're doing a lot of good in the early phase, trying to get the program and policy right. We'll do some good later in some other places doing some building, but ultimately the sort of best thing we could do was to use our expertise to help try and get the programmatic stuff correct.
Any particular programs or even just kind of themes, problems that you've tackled with reference to the state broadband offices that you'd want to share to our listeners here?
Sure. So, the state's responses to these federal programs have been as different as the states themselves. If you go to each state broadband office, they often comply with the same statutes, but they've done a good job really trying to meet the requirements of their unique facts and circumstances of their state. And that's sort of the point of doing it as block grants versus the federal government making those awards to companies directly. And one of the things we've seen be very successful with a number of the states who have been progressive on this has been not to craft a one-size-fits-all solution. And so one thing that we think is a best practice is to look at a variety of tools to deploy federal funds to meet different requirements. For example, there are places where there is no broadband at all, and there's not broadband anywhere near it. And to get to it, you need somebody to bite off the whole project. And so you're making a big monolithic award to someone to go cover a place. So that's one kind of program with certain specific requirements. There are other places where there's lots of broadband, but there are little pockets where people don't have service. And this would be a classic situation where you're on a long road. Maybe the cable company provides service to the first 10 houses, and that's along like a 2-mile frontage, but the road goes on for 2 more miles and there's only 2 more customers and cable doesn't go the rest of the way. Well, it doesn't make sense, I don't think, to then bring a broadband provider in to rebuild that entire 4 miles of frontage plus everything to get to that road. You just need to extend the line a little further. And so we'll see states have a line extension program where they'll use just a little bit of capital to get to those stranded households. So again, I just think the states who are doing this well often will have a bunch of different nuanced programs to solve a bunch of different kinds of problems.
We have a question here from David Fine. Can you tell us a little about environmental challenges, waterways, protected areas, how to break through those barriers for fiber installations? And why don't you speak for a minute or two about your being up there in Maine and what's the topography and the issues that you've had to deal with just in your backyard?
Sure. So, whether we're talking about a subsidized project or not, one of the great things about America is that it's regulated. People complain a lot about regulation, but not having it be chaos in, deploying things in the field actually leads to a better quality of life. We've got cleaner air and cleaner water and more biodiversity and all that. And so whether we're talking about federal funds that are regulated by, a specific, NEPA requirement that drives specific environmental regulation, or you're just on a commercial project and you're trying to cross a waterway, there's a whole host of permitting activity that needs to happen to be able to build networks successfully. And so one of the good news things about networks is that networks are not intrinsically polluting. Fiber is passive. It doesn't have an electromagnetic field. It just is. It just exists. And it doesn't have a smokestack. In fact, it prevents cars from getting on the road to go have an in-person meeting because you can jump on a Zoom or have a thing like this. And so the kinds of environmental regulation that we see being less like check the box because it was designed for something else that wasn't broadband is when there's civil construction necessary to deploy broadband. And we find this a lot in our underground broadband construction projects. So it's very common for us to have to drill under a waterway to bring broadband, to the other side of the river or the other side of a canal or something. And it's not uncommon that we have to do a lot of excavation, heavy dirt work to get fiber under the streets. And so while there are less invasive ways of doing that, we use horizontal directional drills and micro trenchers and other tools to make less of a mess. You still got to regulate the impact of those civil construction projects. And what I have found is that if you follow the established path that other civil engineering projects take, whether people are building roads or buildings or whatever infrastructure is out in the world, like gas line, if you just show up and work the system in the way the system was designed to do, you walk in through the front door of these agencies and permit your stuff, like using the process they've designed, it goes okay. That takes time, but usually the front door and going through the normal process is the fastest. And, in our engineering team, we have a whole permitting pod and they deal with those kinds of permits. And, you don't think about railroads and canals and endangered animals and things when you're thinking about broadband, but actually civil construction projects have all of that stuff. So what I would say is it's kind of a nuisance, but it's not a showstopper. You just got to follow the process.
We've got a number of questions about wireless versus fiber and which technology to deploy when. Will we be able to get everywhere with fiber or not? And I know I'm piling on one more fiber question here, which is, have you seen a slowdown in fiber deployment? Asked Scott Genovese. If so, do you expect that to pick back up? I'm not hearing of a slowdown in fiber deployment, but I thought I'd ask you.
Yeah. So let me pull that apart a little bit. There's a lot of tension out in the marketplace, particularly in subsidized broadband projects, around who should get that subsidy naturally. And look, if you're a wireless carrier, you think you should get the subsidy. If you're a fiber carrier, you think you should get the subsidy. There are lots of strong opinions on this. And my opinion is a bit more technology neutral. Different tools are used to get different jobs done. And I don't think anybody would disagree that, look, if money were no object, and in some states that's the case relative to these programs, you'd bring fiber to a home if you could. There are places where that's not feasible, and the BEAD program in particular has very clear guidelines around the situations that states can enable wireless providers to close the gap instead of fiber providers. And, I think we'll see some fiber deployed I think we'll see mostly fiber deployed with BEAD dollars and just a tiny bit of wireless because the rules provide only a very narrow path for BEAD dollars to go to wireless. However, out in the world, outside of the subsidized world, there's a ton of broadband getting built, and some of it's wireless and some of it's fiber. And I think what we'll see over time is that the total addressable market of wireless sort of served prems is going to go down, and the total addressable market of fiber served prems is going to go up. And most state governments are going to drive a fiber first agenda, as is what we've seen. But I really do believe there are certain circumstances, extremely high cost circumstances, where resources are limited, where sometimes wireless can get the job done in a way that fiber can't. On the question of fiber slowdown, it's hard to understand what's going on in the fiber economy, because if you look at a given company, it doesn't reflect the entire market. And so there are a number of fiber companies that have slowed their fiber build programs, not because there's anything wrong with the intrinsic unit economics of fiber or their belief in their customers' interest in that product, but because of their own financial situation and structural debt from technologies before fiber. So legacy, these are some of the legacy telephone companies have run into situations where they need to deal with their capital structure before they can continue building fiber. I think those are one-off situations that are in regards to those specific companies, but interest rates are real. And the high interest rate environment that we have put more pressure on those companies and driven those situations into a more acute phase and slowed down, I think have meaningfully slowed down some fiber projects. Writ large, across the whole country, across all kinds of ISPs, we've never been busier, and we're getting new orders every day. And so I think in general, fiber deployment is really strong, but interest rates have put pressure on companies who have other structural financial problems, and also cause projects that I would consider to be maybe kind of borderline, not well constructed projects to fail and to stop. But those were vulnerable projects to dying a bad death for other reasons. But I think writ large, the fiber to the home economy is really healthy.
All right, this is my penultimate question for you, Josh. This is from Manny Vannon, and Vanny highlights, great to hear each state broadband office is crafting a plan unique to specific requirements. How do we ensure that we optimize the overall national plan for public-private partnerships? And I might even just throw in here, what is good software? What are the tools that state broadband offices or that Tilson uses or needs to use to kind of optimize those kind of high-level designs?
Yeah, so if I'm kind of ferreting out what's at the core of Manny's question, he's sort of speaking to the tension between these state-specific requirements and sort of maybe what the federal government has retained as their role in ensuring the projects go in a certain way. And I think the reality of the situation is that once you get through writing the statute, Congress says do X, and then the agency writes their rules, and publishes those rules in the Federal Register and says, Congress asks us to do X, here's how we're going to do it. Mostly the die has been cast. And in the statute says the states are going to make a lot of decisions. And the rules say Congress said the states are going to make a lot of decisions. But the NTIA in particular has retained some discretion in requiring the states to deploy a plan before they go do the thing and submit that plan, and for them to review and provide feedback and approve those plans. And so I think we're into that now. If folks are paying close attention to what's going on in their state, they should note that states have been having open comment periods to these draft plans, and they got to pay close attention because those open up and they close, and you kind of lose if you want to have a voice, you got to act now and make the window when they're soliciting that feedback. That window's closed in a number of states already. And then the plans go to the NTIA, and the NTIA approves them. And I think just the other day they approved Virginia. So that process is actually sort of playing out here in real time. And so I think actually the federal government has a relatively modest role to play here. Manny asked about sort of public-private partnerships as a model. And one of the things that the BEAD statute, the IIJA that sort of defined the BEAD program says is that basically every kind of entity can participate. Utilities, private companies, public instrumentalities, PPPs ought to be an eligible agency or an eligible entity to do a thing. but nothing in that statute says they have to be, and nothing in the ATA rule said they have to be. So then you got to look at the state program and say, does the gravity of this state program favor a PPP structure or not? So I think that's, still soon to be seen.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
We're running out of time,
yeah.
and we can't end without hearing about lab rats. All right. So we chatted about this earlier. Tell us about how you've gotten involved in lab rats and what that tells us about broadband, if anything.
Gosh. So Drew and I were talking before the show about some of my extracurricular activities, and I'm on a bunch of boards outside of my day job at Tilson, and one of the boards is actually not rats, it's mice. We really like it. Rats are the bad guys. Mice are really helpful. Mice are helpful for research.
Precise definition there.
But I'm on a number of boards. Some are around broadband. I'm on the board of Vetro, a fiber management software. I'm on the board of Versant, investor-owned utility, and I'm on the board in Maine of an organization called the Jackson Labs, which actually manufactures mice. If you're doing research and you need a mouse that is the same genetically as a 1958 experiment on cystic fibrosis, you call these guys and they send you a box of live mice a few weeks later that have that exact sort of gene profile. And so it's a global biotech. It has about 2,500 employees. It's actually structured as a nonprofit, which is unusual for a thing that does that. And so what I found is that board service and adjacent industries helps me understand kind of what's going out in the bigger economy and gives me a little more perspective to take home to Tilson.
Anything else you'd like to say before we end this great discussion? And thank you for spending this hour with us, Josh.
Yeah, I would just like to say that, with all this funding going into broadband, there's going to be a lot of linemen and other technicians out on the roads doing work. And so put your cell phone down, pay attention to your driving, and, respect those work zones, because what these guys are doing is really important for our economy, but it's also life or death for them. And it'd be really important that we protect the safety of our crews out doing this work, and, pick our head up from the policy and recognize that at the end of the day, all of this funding and all of these technologies, lead to a person in a bucket truck, doing the work.
Well, that will have to be our last word. A reminder, we've got a really special Ask Me Anything event coming up next Thursday, the 9th, involving a discussion around these letter of credit issues that Josh and I talked about during the session. And we are looking forward to future Ask Me Anythings. We are hoping to get Oklahoma State Broadband Officer November 17th, as well as many more in the near future. On behalf of our guest, Josh Broder, I'm Drew Clark. We'll see you next week. Take care.
Bye-bye.